Shannon, number 2. And I totally forgot to have music ready, so that's why you're not hearing any music.
There's no music.
La, 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 la. And hey, here's Shannon and I. How are you, everybody?
Hello.
Oh, what is playing right now? Holy crap. All right, you talk for a second. I'm going to turn my mic off.
Okay. I'm going to talk right now. Okay. Am I talking about sewing patterns?
I'm back.
Okay, he's back.
YouTube video just started playing. I didn't hit play. I didn't do nothing.
Oh.
And I have 3 screens with like 72 tabs open. And I'm like, oh my God, where is that coming from?
Well, somebody posted that. They posted Madonna song Vogue and in the Secret Beach. So that was probably the song we should have had ready.
Yeah. But that was so weird that YouTube just starts playing on its own. Hello, I'm Haunted. Thank you very much. So Shannon's back, and this time she is going to be schooling us on sewing patterns. And I talked about it a little bit in the quick live I did a couple hours ago to remind everybody. And the thing I like about sewing patterns is the same thing I like about cassettes and CDs, because for the most part, they're all the same size.
Right. And there's the big oversized Vogue patterns, but then a lot of the other ones are pretty much the same. So you can get 2 different size bubble mailers and you're good.
Yeah, when you can find a product that once you know how to do it once, you're good. That's a great product to really work on, because you could buy a pair of little kitty jeans that weigh like 7 ounces, or you could buy a pair of men's jeans that are 70 waist that'll be like 3 pounds. And so yes, they're both pairs of jeans, but man, they're gonna be a lot different in shipping. Sewing patterns, CDs, cassettes, they're all the same. So
easy to ship.
All right, so I am. I'm going to just turn me off, and if I got to pop in to say something, I'll say something. But I'm going to hand the floor to Shannon, or the beach as it is, to Shannon, and she's off and running. So Shannon, as before, I'll be moving the slides, but if you feel like I haven't moved it yet and you need to move it, just say next slide, please.
Okay, I will do so.
All righty, I'm out here. Enjoy, everybody.
All right, so we today are talking about slingin sewing patterns, or selling sewing patterns. And we'll just go ahead and go into our first slide there. Okay, so just wanted to talk about selling sewing patterns in general. Some of you probably already do it. I noticed that from some of the comments in the Secret Beach. And some of you are brand new to it or have never looked at the sewing pattern section at the thrift store. But I just wanted to share that this is just my methods of doing this. Even as I've talked to different people about sewing patterns, or different groups I'm in, or things like that, people have a few different variations of how they do it, or what kind of patterns they like to sell, and different things like that. So I'm just going to share what works for me, and if something else is working for you, then go for it. But just like in any selling niche, you got to kind of make it work for you and what you have in your area. Yes, we don't even want to talk about my sewing pattern profit pile, because as it says there, the triple threat, they're easy to source. Oh my goodness, I have like 5 bins, like the big old bins full of sewing patterns, but we'll talk about that later.
And do you know how many are in each bin?
No, and I'm not counting them either, because you can fit a lot of patterns in each bin. And I did cull through some of them recently, and I lotted up some things in different categories that I wasn't so interested in selling, and I donated a bunch too. But anyway, we'll talk about that later. So it's not a get rich quick kind of thing. It's another just little kind of niche to add. I do I do flatware, and I do sewing patterns, and I do costume jewelry and coffee mugs and all sorts of different things. So it's just kind of another nice, easy one to add into your repertoire, if you want to call it that. So there will be some knock your socks off sales in sewing patterns that will surprise you, and I will show you on the next slide is one of my best sales I had in sewing patterns. So this was a Star Wars. It's in quotes because that pattern is not specifically licensed as Star Wars. We'll talk about that in a minute. And it also, one thing you want to know, it has simplicity. it has 2 numbers. That does happen sometimes with sewing patterns. It goes by different numbers. But I sourced that one for, I'm going to say 50 cents, $1 at the most, but it sold for $145. So that's a great one to keep an eye out for. I'm guessing it's the type that you would notice if if you saw it at a thrift store, you'd probably stop and double check that one, I would think. But most of my sales, Jason showed up again.
Yeah, I was going to ask a question. I didn't want to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
So on that size A, are you going to talk about that?
Sure, I can. In there, it just says size A, and it's got the sizes listed. The size A, B, F, F, G, things like that. I don't necessarily put that into my listing or my title. I put the important part after it. So whatever the size that was extra small to extra large, I just go ahead and put all those sizes in it. But I don't worry so much about the pattern company's designation of what that size is. Okay, so for the most part, the rest of the my sewing sales are going to be more bread and butter, like the next slide shows. Okay, so just a Vogue pattern. It's from 2015. It sold for $12.99. Now I did have free shipping on that. It did sell internationally, which patterns can do. And I use pirate ship now, so $10 to ship a pattern. And so use pirate ship because that'll be the cheapest option at this point. Okay, next one. So looking for sewing patterns. Now, like we've talked about in the chat, there might be some thrift stores that don't have them anymore. Value Village Savers, I think, pretty much always still have a big section. It's usually back in the linens. I think it's categorized in their linens. So it's linen sewing sheets. All those things are together. Crafts type stuff is back there. So Value Village is a good spot. My Goodwills, it happened in my area too. They pretty much just don't have them. Once in a while, there'll be a big bundle in a bag. But my little thrifts, the little stores, they have them usually priced about 10 cents each. Value Village in my area it's a standard 49 cents for each one, and then you can wait for the color tag off also. But then there's yard sales, estate sales. I've sourced both of those. If you go to an estate sale and you hit a craft room, sometimes the woman has just boxes and boxes, or had boxes and boxes of sewing patterns, and you can make a deal sometimes on the whole lot. And then online, this is how I've gotten myself into trouble with the amount of patterns that I have, because a lot of people don't want to deal with them individually, and so they lot them up on eBay, which is also totally an option, especially if you come across a big lot at an estate sale. You can look on eBay, Etsy, Mercari. Most of the patterns I have right now started out, I found a lot of really good Vogue patterns on Mercari, and I noticed she had more listed, more lots, and then she kept adding more, and I kept buying more. And then I was listing a pattern in online, one of the Facebook groups for vintage patterns. She was there and she said, "Oh, I didn't know you liked vintage patterns too." She said, "I've got boxes and boxes of those." And so it turned out that she had rescued somebody's estate. This man was just going to throw away all his wife's patterns. And so she got them all, and then she just wanted to share them, but she had so many. And so she was moving, and she just needed to sell the rest. So I bought the rest of those. But I've gotten some awesome Vogue patterns and others out of the deal, and I'm still working on it.
So are we talking hundreds or thousands?
Oh, yeah, there was probably thousands something. I should count one of these days. I don't think my husband wants to know, but at least they fit small, right? They're compact, right? So anyway.
So the one thing I'll say about, I'm gonna mute. We got this weird feedback, so when I'll talk, I'm gonna mute you for a second,
Okay.
Shannon.
Okay.
because I think that'll fix it. Yeah, that's a weird thing. The one thing I will say about savers in this part of the world, so Vegas and the LA ones, they're typically on the end caps in the linen section. Sometimes on the wall, but at least around here, it's the end caps in all the linen section, and there's usually a couple. So, keep your eyes peeled. Don't ignore end caps. There's always good stuff to be found in end caps, and this is where I find a lot of the stuff like this in our neck of the woods.
Okay. Yes, definitely. Our Valley Village has them on the wall, but sometimes they're buried underneath pillows and all sorts of sheets and things like that too. I can see that question. Should I just go ahead and answer that question now?
Yeah, I'll just pop them up as they come.
Okay. So the pattern sizes, yes, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The bigger, the better. And that's especially true. We'll talk about that when we talk about vintage patterns, especially true with vintage patterns because the vintage sizing is different than current sizing. So if you can find a larger vintage size, that's going to be closer to kind of the average size of a person today. And lots of people want to wear vintage, and a lot of the vintage patterns are for teeny tiny little people. And so, yes, but in general, plus size patterns are an awesome thing to find and sell. Okay.
So teeny tiny like me.
Yeah, like your calf, maybe. No.
I wear this nice Vogue thing on my calf. Nice.
There you go. Okay, so reselling, obviously, the usual places, eBay. My Vogue patterns seem to do pretty well on eBay, as opposed to maybe Amazon. I don't know. Someone else had mentioned that too, that they have certain ones that sell better on Amazon as opposed to eBay. I'm doing okay with Vogue on eBay, newer and older, so I'm sticking with that. I do cross post, but that's a different subject. So Etsy, there's lots of patterns that actually they can sell for a lot more. If you look at the prices on Etsy versus eBay, they can sell for more on Etsy. It just might take longer, so you have to keep that in mind too. And then any kind of pattern can be sold on Etsy, because if you have a vintage pattern, you can go ahead and put it in supplies, but you could put it in vintage. But if you have a brand new 2012, 2017 pattern, it's a supply and it can be sold on Etsy as well. Now, Amazon, when I first was selling patterns, I would check Amazon, and there were some on there, but lots and lots, especially vintage pattern listings have been added, so you don't have to create the listing yourself, which you definitely can. I don't do FBA, I do merchant fulfilled. A lot of times you can make a few extra cents, maybe $1 on the shipping, because it's a lighter weight type of thing. I tend to just kind of stick with one that looks new and like not a lot of storage wear, and it just looks like it's in good shape. Those are the ones I use for Amazon. And then there's lots of buy sell groups on Facebook. To me, it seemed like a few years back they were really hopping, and you could sell things pretty quickly on there. I don't know if they got oversaturated or whatever, but if you have a very collectible or vintage pattern, there are groups with serious collectors, and that might be a good spot to share with them.
So on those specialty groups, Shannon, I'm in a bunch for Tiki Mugs. I know, shocker. But when you join those, can you join and right away go, hey, I got this for sale? Or do you got to kind of introduce yourself, wait around, see how it flows? Or can you kind of jump in and start selling?
If it's a buy-sell group, you can jump in and start selling. There's one I know of. It's like Vintage Sewing Pattern Nerds. They have a group that's not buying and selling, and you can go in there. And I've learned a lot just being in there. I've learned what people think are, wow, a pattern, that they get all excited about, and it's helped me know what to look for. But they don't want selling or pricing questions or things like that in that group, and you have to respect that. But they have a sister group. They have one that's for high-end patterns, and they have one for like bargain patterns, they call it, but still only vintage. They don't want anything newer than 1980, and they prefer 40s, 50s, things like that. So So it just depends on the group, you know.
So last night or 2 nights ago, I started thinning the herd of tiki mugs, which will take quite a while. But I was in I was in 4 tiki for sale mug groups, and then 2 collectors groups that don't mind for sale posts. So I posted the same thing everywhere, and it sold in, I think, 2 hours. And the average selling price on eBay was 35. And I'm like, but no one's seen one for a couple months. Let's try 50. And boom, sold for 50 right away. So if you're into something specific, sewing patterns, tiki mugs, yeah, go find those groups. Just make sure you understand the flow of the group and then hop in there. And you might be able to get some quick direct sales, no eBay fees. Depending on how they'll want to pay, you might not have PayPal fees. Do with that what you may. But it's a good, easy way to sell all kinds of stuff.
Yes, definitely. So lots of options for sewing patterns. Okay, now pricing, this is where it gets tricky, okay? And people are very sensitive about this. And it depends on, again, it depends on your style. So there are some who just want to, they'll price their patterns low, but they have a high volume and they're just gonna slam the patterns out there. And they're either gonna get people to buy multiples at once, or they're just okay with selling it how they sell it. Or maybe like with postcards, they're not gonna worry so much about providing tracking numbers and they're going to use the lower shipping. So it just depends on how you prefer to do things. I still prefer to be a little more selective, and I don't want to list my patterns under, say, like $10, that minimum plus shipping. And so, I try to stay there. And we have to be realistic about it, because yeah, I mean, it's easy to say, like, don't price your patterns too low, because a lot of people will just get on there and just do a 99-cent auction on every single pattern they have, and they're selling them for $2 or $3. And you see that a lot, right? But there's lots of patterns out there that are rare. They're not rare. They're not hard to find. There's so many of them available. So it might not be worth it to list that one individually. It might just be, lot up a group of, dresses that are all the same size, and put those together, or something like that. Or the other option is just be discerning, like myself. Don't buy everything you see. Just kidding. But as at this point, with the backlog I have, when I go thrifting, I am a lot more selective. I'm looking at my Vogue patterns and I'm scanning them on Amazon, or I'm scanning them with the eBay app, and see what the asking price is before I'm bringing them home. So, but it's sensitive, people, don't price too low, because then it affects the whole market too. All right, so patterns to look for. Okay, I've mentioned Vogue a few times. It's definitely my top seller. They're very good patterns, and there's so many different types. I have some more later I can show, and then also we'll talk about it a little bit more later. But Vogue is definitely my top seller. Simplicity is very solid. Butterick, McCall's, those are the big 4 big names. Now, let me see if I can find. There's also some of the ones I listed there. Ours is like Advanced. I gotta line this up. Okay, that's going to be a vintage pattern. I think they're connected to one of the others. I don't remember who, but anyway, those are vintage. Those are a little bit harder to sell. This one, we'll talk about men's a little bit later, and that one should do okay. And then what did we talk about? There's Berta. There's I'm just gonna find an example of each one. Oh yeah, so here's a newer Berta pattern. Is one name. It comes out of Germany, I believe. A lot of times the older ones are in a plastic sleeve. You'll find those at the store in a plastic sleeve, and a lot of times it's sealed. One of the few kind that are sealed. But that's a newer Berta. Then there's mail order. Back in the day, people could order patterns in the mail. And so here's one. These are kind of fun, because they would order from a catalog, or from the back of their Family Circle magazine or something. And so then the patterns come like this, right? And that's kind of fun. And then all the pieces are inside. And that one's already been used and cut, so, but that's just kind of cool. I knew someone would mention stretch and sew, so I pulled one out. Here's a stretch and sew. I don't love stretch and sew. It's made for knit material. Okay, so it's kind of very specific. I do have, I should say, probably about 20, 25, 30 of these, and I've been planning on lotting them up, but they're at the bottom of a bin. So I'm going to just try lotting them up and going. I think there are some stretch and sew in general that we talk about later. Leotards and dance clothing and certain ones like that can still do pretty good. But stretch and sew, it's not. I don't get super excited. Green pepper is another one. Here we go with dance clothes. But green pepper also makes some of the outdoor, like a fleece vest and things like that, cargo pants, and I've done pretty well with those. So who else? Smaller private companies. Yeah, it just depends. Sometimes it just depends on the maker. But so or that's what I mean. It depends on the item anyway. So there's a question about whether there's many returns. I've never had a return on a pattern. Ever, 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 ever. Okay. We talked about that. Okay, next slide is also other things you can keep an eye out for. So there's a lot of there's Hawaiian, right? So Patterns Pacifica can be a really good one. Victoria Jones is also Hawaiian patterns. Then there's, I pulled these out later, Paloa, I'm not saying that right, Paloa patterns, also Hawaiian, and then Polynesian patterns. So those usually will do fine. Then there's one I did, authentic, right? So you're kind of looking for things that are just a little bit out of the ordinary. So authentic patterns, Western, they do a lot of Western, riding clothes, square dance clothes. Now this is a kind of a big heavy, these are big heavy patterns. They're going to be a little bit heavier than you're used to. And then here's another one, folkwear. Okay, those can do okay. They're kind of also go into the costume, ethnic type category. Okay, so those are other ones you can kind of keep your eye out for. Again, it has to do with kind of a specialty. Sometimes there's specialty clothing and outfits, and that's always going to be good.
The pants on that first Western one you showed were really tight.
I was trying to...
Oops. Make you the full screen. Yeah.
I think they'll sell quickly. And I think they're from the 80s or something. I don't know. I don't see a date on it.
I'm assuming you're going to be talking about cut and uncut coming up.
Oh, yes.
Okay, cool. So I saw that question, but I am sure that's in part of your presentation.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Okay. Well, we're talking about categories. There's so many categories of patterns. I mean, I didn't even talk about just women's clothing, because that's about 90% of the patterns that you're going to see in a thrift store is just women's dresses and shirts and skirts and pants and things like that. So that'll just depend on, there's nothing to like specifically say. Like Vogue, I can sell most Vogue patterns, but even just, women's ordinary clothing. But let's just talk about, like, these categories are a little bit specific, and that's something that, even if you get into patterns, you could just specialize and just say, you know what, I'm only going to sell craft patterns, or I'm only going to sell vintage patterns. Or you could just do a little bit of everything, like I do. The one topic or one category that I tend to avoid at this point now is home decor. So in case that comes up, I've not done well with home decor patterns. So you might have a different experience, but that's just me. So I didn't really go into talking about it. So let's look at vintage first. The earlier, obviously, the earlier can be really good, can be very valuable. So they're usually worth taking a look at. I have a few older ones here, just really cool styles that you'll see on them. This one's pretty. I wish I had the fabric. It's got like little cherries on the fabric. Okay, so just older vintage ones. Now they can, if you've probably noticed on there, if somebody really wants that pattern, obviously it would be better if this envelope was pristine, but it's ripped and it's taped and it's got issues. But you know, a collector will be okay with that. It'll be fine. You just take pictures of the envelope and disclose it and everything like that. So, but even we're talking even older patterns, condition will not matter at all, because there's people who have, even in some of these groups that we're talking about on Facebook, they run archives and they're trying to keep track of patterns. And sometimes if it's an old enough pattern, then it's part of history, and they want to see it, and they collect it and buy it. So if we go to the next slide, I think there's an example, some examples of some of the patterns go back to the 1890s, 1880s. And so you can kind of see what they look like. They just look like newspaper articles. They're not, you know, they might not stand out to you, but, you know, if you're in the middle of some ephemera or something in a sewing room, you know, keep an eye out for things like this. If you notice, I'm going to mention one thing. If you notice the pattern on the left, the pattern pieces are there and they're called unprinted. I should have probably made a slide about this. But older patterns, most patterns will be printed. In other words, there's the lines on the pattern pieces and you cut out according to the lines, and that's why we call it cut. Older patterns didn't have that. The pieces were already cut out and they were blank. Okay. And so when you get something like that, and if you're going to determine whether it's complete, they have little letters printed on them in holes. It's hard to describe. I wish I had one. I should show you. They have a chart on the back of the envelope that explains how many pattern pieces there are, and like this pattern piece, letter F, and then there's E and D and C and A. And so you can look at your pile of pieces if you want and see if it's complete, everything that's in the envelope. But that's really the early vintage ones. Simplicity, McCall's, and they pretty much early on in the 40s, 50s started printing the lines on the patterns and had people cut them out, things like that. So that's just a something you'll come across once in a while. But those are really old patterns. I would love to find something like that. But the next one will show you the prices. Here's some prices on some. I just kind of did a high to low on some like 30s, 40s patterns. If you're looking at something and it looks like something from Mary on Downton Abbey would be wearing about now in the 20s, 30s, or you look at it and you're like, oh my goodness, look at that dress, then it's probably something worth grabbing and worth, checking it out. And the condition on those looks really good, so I'm sure that has something to do with it too. Also, like I mentioned before, plus sizes in these types of patterns are, if you can find one with it might say size 18, size 20, but the bust is like 36, or, then it's going to be what people are looking for. Okay, and so then my oldest pattern that I've ever found, these are actually, it was a book, and it's from 1910, and it was a school book for little girls to learn how to sew at school. And in the back, it had this little collection of doll patterns, and they were by McCall's. Now, it was before McCall's. It's called McCall's now, but it was called McCall at a certain point. But even before, this is even before that, it says James McCall on the side. So these are just these little teeny tiny doll patterns. And as far as I could tell, all the pieces were included in each one. It was amazing. And I saw it on Etsy. Someone was selling it for $30. So I bought it. And I thought, knowing from those Facebook groups how they love these early patterns. I thought it would be great. I showed it in one of the Facebook groups just to kind of get some information, and nobody was like, oh, I'm interested. And so I went ahead and put it on eBay, and I sold it overseas actually for $130. That's the oldest one I think I found.
I love the sourcing on one to another.
Uh-huh.
I love that.
Yeah. Okay, so then we move on. You can also, as you can imagine, with Mad Men and everything, 50s and 60s patterns, rockabilly styles. So not just the full skirted dresses, but I should have mentioned also like the wiggle dresses, they call them, that are tight all the way down. Mid-century is still popular. You know, the Mad Men craze probably died down a little bit, so that could have been part of why the mid-century patterns on the vintage groups are not flying like they were. It's kind of calmed down a little bit, but people are still interested in this type of style, so it'll always be a good one. The next one, 70s, 80s, 90s, there's still styles, there's still resurgences in those things. I sell a lot of jumpsuit patterns. For a while, when I was selling on Facebook a year or so ago, this lady wanted every jumpsuit pattern that I had. And I don't know, she had some kind of business where I think they were making jumpsuits. But so there's the boho styles. Anything from the 90s is doing really good right now. Visco, like Jason talked about with his mom, and hippie styles, like all these things are still popular. So kind of, you know, you look for those things that people are wearing now, and the patterns from back then will still be sellable. And a lot of those Vogue patterns I got from Mercari are 1990s, and they're selling. They're just kind of basic skirts, dresses, things like that, but people like the 90s right now. Okay, so then if we move up, yeah, Christine says Australians buy up a lot of patterns. That is definitely true. When international shipping was a little bit cheaper, it was, I sold more internationally. Yeah, like Rick says, like you still should sell internationally, and Pirate Ship has helped with that. But when prices went up, I noticed it did drop a little bit, my international sales. But okay, so anyway, talking in the next category is costumes. Okay, this is probably like one of the biggest categories, and people will, you know, your eyes would probably be drawn to things in this category if you're looking through patterns at the thrift store. So it is not just for Halloween. So all year round, we have small town theaters or Broadway, Hollywood wardrobe departments. People are putting on school plays. They're your customers all year round. There's Renaissance festivals. There's a lot of Renaissance medieval costumes out there. People are using those, like that one at the top, Butterick. People are using those for wedding dresses too. So it might be categorized even by Butterick or McCall's as a Renaissance costume, but it's also a wedding gown style that people look for as well. Then there's cosplay, there's all sorts of things. So costume patterns, don't just wait till September, October. They will sell all the time. Okay, so here's some of the ones that anyway, that yeah, you can bolo these costume patterns. These are one of the higher ones. If we just start at the top left, that Aladdin type costume. You know, let's talk about licensing for a second. Okay, so Spider-Man down below is licensed, right? It says Spider-Man right on it. Aladdin, that's not licensed. Now, you can use those. I use those keywords more often on Etsy than I do on eBay. I find most pattern buyers know the pattern brand and number that they're looking for when they're looking for a specific thing. So I try not to throw in the thing, even though mostly everybody does it. I might even have put Star Wars in that other one. I don't remember, but I didn't get in trouble for it. So I'm not recommending saying Aladdin if you have that. I just think the people who want it know that it's Butter 3048 or 3049 is a kid's version of the same pattern. So yeah, it can go from $30 to $60. Next one over is a Hawaiian dress. I would love to find that pattern. That's awesome. It sells for about $50. It just looks like one that you could come across any day in a bin of patterns. Next one is Star Wars. Again, the Princess Leia, or I don't know, I can't see it. Next one, McCall's. It's the Renaissance historical costumes. I find that the men's version of the Renaissance costumes can be big bucks. I've sold different, like King Henry VIII or whoever. There's a good pattern for him, and it's like $50 or something. But they're always worth double checking. And not every Renaissance pattern. There's tons by McCall's and Butterick that are, you look them up and they're selling for $5. And so, yeah, you still have to double check. Spider-Man, that's a new one. When I was researching this on my blog also, I hadn't seen that one, and that's definitely one I'll be looking for. It goes for about $40 to $45. Another new one was the Mexican dance dress. I have not seen that one before. When I researched this, it had recently sold for about $60 on eBay. And then the Marie Antoinette style is a $35, $40 costume pattern. So definitely worth looking at. I did talk about this on my blog one day, and a lady wrote to me and said, you know, I always skip the patterns, but I looked at the patterns this week, and at her store right on top was that Aladdin style costume. So she was all excited about that. Okay, another category is, let me double check I didn't miss anything. I wanted to say, oh, back with costumes, just real quick, kind of related, is I kind of categorize them as ethnic. They're not necessarily, I wouldn't call them a costume because it's clothing that people wear every day. So we talked about that with the Hawaiian patterns, but I've sold like a Japanese kimono pattern, and I've sold I don't even remember what it's called, but for something Korean people wear. I've sold African styles. I've sold different things like that. So ethnic is also something to kind of keep in mind for when you're looking, but I wouldn't call them a costume. But okay, so craft and doll patterns. Again, here sometimes we have things that are licensed and sometimes not. So same thing with the Barbie patterns on Etsy. I usually call them Barbie. On eBay, I just call it the 11.5-inch fashion doll. Unless it's like this one and it's licensed, it says Barbie right on it. Okay, that's an older one. That's another one by Advance. But things like that. So you'll see some licensed ones, Cabbage Patch Kid, clothing. There we go. Things like that. For Cabbage Patch Kids, you see Annie on there, Raggedy Ann and Andy. Dolls do pretty well. So there's some that you can do individually, but then sometimes like there's some Barbie clothing patterns that aren't worth much individually. And oh, cool. Okay. Anyway, so I'm reading the comments, but anyway, so you know, Rainbow Bright can sell for really good money. Care Bears can sell for really good money. But you might have a bunch of ones that fit Barbie dolls, and each one only sells for like $5, $3, $4. But if you do a big lot of them, people will buy a lot of Barbie clothing and a lot of American Girl. Same thing. Some are licensed American Girl and say it right on there, and others are just 18-inch doll. There's a ton of 18-inch doll patterns out there. Then there's things for our pets clothing, pet accessories. Those are always fun. And here's an example. Pet. Anyway, there's a pug on there. I told Jason.
Love it.
All right, so that's craft and doll. So someone in the chat had mentioned the MC Hammer. I have not seen that one, but I also, oh my goodness, that's awesome. It would be cool if you bought the one for $9 and sold it for $99. But I also, researching today, looked real quick, and there's an Elvis costume that is also a very good one to look for, and I had never seen that one before either. Okay, baby and children's patterns. This is not my favorite category of patterns to sell, and I recently just took all my baby and children's patterns and sold them in one big lot because I said, you know what, I don't like them, so I'm not listing them, and so they're just sitting. So I just decided to let someone else who wants that kind of business to do that. Now I know I'm kind of honing down certain ones to look for. So 40s and 50s for babies and toddlers. Some of those are actually really, really valuable. Now dresses with smocking. This is something, I gotta find my example. At the top McCall's is a picture, is an example, okay? But here's one that's kind of falling apart that I have. Okay, so the part up here, over here on the dress, up here on the collar, I don't even sew, but so you all probably know this better than I do. But it's called smocking, and if you see something like this on the envelope, okay, it's kind of that gathered part of the dress on a little girl's dress. Those are really popular, actually. People like to collect, especially the vintage ones. Now inside, okay, here's another example. I have Children's Corner, does a lot of ones with smocking, okay? And so one thing to double check, they don't all have it. Sometimes there's a transfer for the pattern, or sometimes there's just, it's like a pattern for the smocking. Now I'm not gonna be able to find it. Anyway, it just looks like a graph with a bunch of dots, and it kind of looks like this. You can see it's just a bunch of dots on this graph. Anyway, it's kind of, sometimes, like I said, it's a transfer that they can transfer that pattern onto their fabric. But if the envelope says that should be in there, then you want to double check that that's in there, because that'll be important. Okay, dresses with smocking. Now here's a bolo. I will definitely double check looking at baby patterns if I found one that sold for $103 like this. So yeah, it's hard to even understand or predict, but I've looked at some auctions of like vintage 40s, 50s baby toddler clothing, and like the sunsuits always do really good, certain little dresses, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly which ones, but I would pick up a sunsuit. Look at that. That's awesome. Okay, then men's patterns. That's another category that you could specialize in a little bit. There's just not as many. Like I said before, 90% of the patterns you'll see at a thrift store, if not more, are going to be for women, for kids. But men's patterns do sell. Western patterns, especially cowboy type shirts. Also think the 40s, 50s again, the rockabilly styles. The men's costumes, like I said before, in costumes, the men's costumes are a little more rare, and those will possibly go for, sometimes tend to sell a little bit higher than the women's version. And then I've actually, when I looked back through I have an Etsy shop that's sewing patterns, and I looked through, and a lot of the patterns I sold for men's were like just for ties, cummerbund scarves. It's one accessories pattern that covers a bunch of different things. And okay, all right, here we go. So things to know about sewing patterns. So as you've seen on a lot of these that I've shown you, okay, you have a pattern and it's open. It does not mean it's used automatically. This is how, when you go to Walmart and you open the pattern drawers and you pull out a pattern, they are open. And there was a deal about the pattern store supposed to rip off the flap and keep, they never, like, I don't know. I hardly ever find any that are ripped off at a thrift store. Anyway, so that's what it looks like. So when you get a pattern, you have to, or if you're at the store, you're going to see, okay, is this cut, is this uncut, or is it uncut and factory folded? So this one, I'm going to hold it still for a bit. You can look right in there, and it looks like super, I'm sorry, the camera is like, okay, it looks super neat and easily folded, right? So, and I've gotten to the point where I can kind of feel what an uncut pattern feels like. Feeling up my patterns. Okay, and then if you pull it out, you see how it's folded like the instruction book is there, and it's like folded so neatly. Because I tell you, once you unfold a pattern, folding it back up and getting it back in the envelope is not easy. So you'll kind of know when people have done that. Okay. So anyway, next slide, I think. Yeah. Okay. So a cut pattern, like we said, if you look at it real quick, here's a Vogue pattern that I have. Okay. And so I haven't listed it yet because it's cut. Those go to the bottom of my pile. Okay. So if you look at it, it's messy, right? You can look in the envelope and be like, all right, somebody used that one. There's pieces, parts sticking out all over the place. Okay, so that's fairly easy to spot the difference, right, when you're looking at a store. Okay, so then, okay, like I said, sometimes there are people who do cut them. I have been fooled. I have gotten a vintage pattern, especially women who like sewed every day and everything. They'll fold up their cut pieces super neatly and iron them, and then they fit really nice. And that's when I go to list it, I'm like, oh, it's cut already, and so then I have to check it and everything. So then sometimes it's not, like I said, you could unfold a huge pattern and trying to get it back in. You can kind of tell it's not what they call, if we go to the next slide, they call it factory folded. Okay, so that first one I showed you that was like super, super neat. That is factory folded. So let's go to the next slide. There we go. So uncut, you sometimes on the pattern title, if people have run out of room, they put FF to show factory fold, means never been used, never been unfolded, never nothing. Okay. You don't need one. If you see one that's factory folded, you don't have to like double check everything is there. I never do. It should be good to go. Yes, exactly, Christine. Don't unfold because it's a beast and you're never going to want to ever deal with it ever again. Okay. But just because a pattern is cut does not mean, like this one we were talking about, maybe this one. This is a Vogue. Oh no, let's do this one because it's one of my favorite designers. Okay, this is a Vogue individualist. Okay, Issey Miyake. I think that's how you say it. Okay, so it's worth, that's a very collectible designer for Vogue. And it's all cut up and it's messy, but it's worth for me to try to figure out whether all the pieces are there and I can still sell it that way. I just have to tell them that it's cut, but I can tell them that it's cut and complete. So like the slide shows, there's a chart on the back. It'll show you, or sometimes it's on the instruction booklet, and it'll show you whether, how many pieces there's supposed to be, whether you have the right pieces, and you can match up the pieces you have to the chart. Now, so it's up to you whether you want to do that kind of work. My cut patterns seem, like I said, they go to the bottom of the pile because it's so much faster to list an uncut pattern. But I will still buy a cut pattern, especially a big Vogue envelope one, designer, vintage one, because I think it's worth it, right? Yes, Issey Miyake, we talk about him later. Those are excellent patterns to sell. Okay, so, that's the other thing you need to know. Let me see if I can find a newer pattern. Okay. So it's like that first one we saw where it's talking about the catalog sizing and how there's multiple sizing on each one. So this one is a 14, 16, 18 size, and sizes are included. And if this one were cut, I would have to tell them, so the sizes are not on separate sheets of paper. They're usually one sheet of paper. And there's lines, there's like small, medium, and large, right? And so if it's cut to the small, then you got to tell them it's cut to the small, right? It's better when it's cut to the larger size because those other smaller sizes are still available. Does that make sense? But if it's a multi-size like that and it's cut, you need to look at it. You need to see which line that they cut it to, and you have to explain that in your listing. Now, vintage patterns, or even like this Vogue is a size 12, and that's it. So there's only just one size in there. So then you just double check that it's cut and complete. Yeah, so you can say cut but complete as long as you want to go ahead and check it. Now that is up to you, whether you want to, like I said before, whether you want to, some people like to grab a stack, sit down in front of their television and just sit there and count pieces and they're all good. The buyer is like, well, you saved me, it saved me a step from having to cut these patterns out, so it's all good, I'll buy it, it's fine. So it just depends. Personally, I focus on uncut patterns because there's so many that I come across all the time that I haven't. Uncut patterns, like I said, I just look at them and I'm like, oh, and so then I just put it off to the side. Okay, let's talk about the pattern listing. Again, this is just how I do things. You can do things totally different. It's totally fine. I start off with the brand and the pattern number. Like I said before, that's generally people know what they're looking for. But then there's people who just want, you know what, I just want a woman's A-line dress pattern or something like that, right? And a size. So I'll start with the brand and pattern number. If I'm doing a Vogue that has a designer, I put that in right away. I say what it is, like the example, an evening gown or a Mrs. skirt. I put the sizes in there. On vintage patterns, I put the bust size as well, because that will give people a better indication of the size more than the vintage. Like the size 12 might not mean as much on a vintage pattern. It's not a today's size 12. It's a vintage size 12. It could really be a size 8 or something in today's size. I explain if it's cut or complete. I only have the word sewing pattern in there, maybe just pattern if there's room. I kind of use the little description on the back of the envelope. And if they have something loose fitting or pullover or A-line or something like that, I might throw those words in the title as well, just for the people who are looking for maybe a specific style. And then next one, photos. I take probably more photos than most people. Again, if you are gonna just slam out low price patterns and just, I know a seller, I forgot where she sourced. She bought out a sewing store or something like that, and she puts things on Amazon and on eBay, but she has multiples of sizes and things like that. So she makes thousands and thousands of dollars every month on her patterns, but she just, she scans the front, scans the back, and that's it. She's done, right? But her stuff is mostly new and not used at all. So when you're dealing more with vintage patterns, it's a little more important. I show the front, I show an up close of the picture of whatever it is. I show the whole back, I show an up close of like the descriptive paragraph. If there's a little diagram over here, I'll get a close up of that. And then I do this now. I pull everything out and just have a picture of the uncut factory folded with the instructions, with the envelope, and to show everything is in there. And then the listing body, I go ahead and I take my title. That's my first line in my listing body. And then you can go ahead and make a template like this, right? Or you can do sell similar, grab a stack of Vogue dresses, size 12, 14, 16. Just grab your stack and just sit there and, sell similar, or even do the multiple listings at once and just change the details. But you can just use a template. You just fill in the information for each one. I go ahead and under description, you'll see there it says pattern and instructions to make. And then I describe what it is. I don't copy I don't type the whole description here. Some people do. I do like a basic summary of what the item is. But I put that first little sentence there, pattern and instructions to make, because especially with costumes, people don't know they're buying sewing patterns. They think they're buying the full costume. I had a lady on Etsy ask me what sizes I had for this costume, and I said, okay, this is a sewing pattern. This isn't the costume itself. It's to make the costume. And I never heard from her again. So, you do the best you can trying to explain to people what it is they're actually getting, but it's not, It's not a full size, it's not a dress, it's a pattern to make a dress. The designer, the year if I know it, and then condition, and then I have a separate one for envelope condition that's more for my vintage ones to explain if there's anything ripped or anything like that. Okay, then shipping, like we said, you keep it super easy. I use a bread bag, tape it up. Sometimes I don't, I just fold it around the pattern neatly, put it in a bubble mailer, get my free eBay mailers from my store. Now you can decide if there's, you know, one of these higher value patterns or a super old collectible pattern, I will go ahead and throw it in a stay flat. It makes the buyer feel better. But for most patterns, $12.99, $14.99, and whatever, I just go ahead and put them in the bubble mailer. People love the extra plastic bread bag moisture thing, even though those are Tyvek bubble mailers. They just like the idea that you were trying to protect the pattern a little bit more from moisture and things like that. Okay, a few more bolos types of things. Maybe these are patterns that I know I have overlooked in the past, but I, you know, as I do this and even as I wrote an article about this on my blog, I learned a lot of patterns I should be looking for. So, okay, so this first one in the top corner, it's a Lizette, it's a Simplicity Lizette designer, I guess. And I've looked up Lizette patterns before, and they're not worth, I mean, they're worth an average pattern. They're not great. But then all of a sudden, this one Lizette dress is worth $100. So now I'm like kicking myself because I don't know if I passed over Lizette this pattern before, but not anymore. Okay, so the Daisy Kingdom apron. This one has been kind of a famous bolo for a long time. I actually have one listed right now, but it is cut. Like I said before, if it's cut and it's worth it, I will do it. But it's cut to a medium, I think. So I think I have it priced a little too high. And the prices on these have come down a little bit. I've sold this pattern uncut for $75 a couple times, but now it's kind of hovering at the $50 range, and so I don't know. With my cut one, I should probably, I'm shooting for like 30, but I should probably drop it. I don't know, or I'll just leave it. Okay, so then the Simplicity up in the top right, the rag rug, these little animal rag rugs, again, I'm sure I've overlooked those before, but they're about $50. I've sold one on Amazon, I've sold one on eBay. Then the next one down is just like an evening dress. It's just kind of a simple spaghetti strap kind of, I probably would have totally passed that one by. That one's about $20 to $35. Another little rug craft pattern, $50. And then in the, you know, if you're looking through the pet ones, these little pet carriers, it's like a $30 pattern. That's, if I'm gonna buy something and, you know, I mean, honestly, a 25-cent pattern or a 10-cent pattern, turning that into $15 is still an amazing ROI. But if I can turn it into 30 or 50 or 70, that's even better. Okay, now here's a good one to keep an eye out for. The Diane von Furstenberg DVF, her wrap dress pattern. What did that one? That one sold for over $100 at auction. Well, just one bid, so they could have just done a buy it now. I have not found this one, and I'm pretty sure this is the high. I did this screenshot real quick. There's another DVF Vogue wrap dress. That's the one I found, and that one's not worth $100, but it's still worth like 20 or 30, so that's good. I think mine is cut, so it's probably still on a pile somewhere to deal with. But I keep my eyes out for that one. And then we talked about Issei Miyake earlier. Okay, this pattern that I'm showing, I sold that one for $60. I've sold several of that designer, $80, $50. You know, it's a good name to keep an eye out for. So then there's all sorts of, we were talking about Vogue patterns in general. There's Vogue Couture Design. Let's see, I think it's Vogue Couture Design. 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 Vogue Couture Desig Okay, so like this one is Gucci, right? So a lot of these are going to kind of catch your eye. I think they're going to catch your eye, right? Because they're beautiful.
I was about to say you're saying couture wrong, and then I'm like, oh nope, there's more letters in that word.
Yeah, it's couture. It's the person, right?
Yeah,
The couturier.
I've never seen that word before.
Yeah, so when you see it on a Vogue, and then Vogue Paris Original is another one to keep an eye out for. Those are going to be the French designers. Those are good. And then there's Vogue American designers. They're so. Like, it just depends. I don't get super excited about the American designers. Um, they're still sellable. Like here's a newer version of some of the Vogue ones. But Calvin Klein, DKNY, those patterns, you're gonna find them all the time. So, the Paris ones, especially the older ones, and the big high name designers are gonna be exciting. So, I mean, I would say in general, if you're just getting your feet wet into patterns, you can't go wrong buying one of the big envelope Vogue patterns, as a general rule. So those are good ones to keep an eye out for. And then this one, I have not seen before, and I was doing research, and here we go again with the keyword. These are, the bags are Gucci, Chanel. It's it's that look to those bags, and that's exactly what they're trying to do there. But they're not licensed that way. And so they went ahead and threw everything out there. And yeah, I mean, it worked. They got 200? I can't see it. But anyway, that's one I would totally keep an eye out for.
275.
275. So yeah, that's amazing. And I have tried to sell certain Vogue handbag, and I've done okay. But I probably I might not have looked twice. I don't know. I might have flipped too quickly. But now I'm going to look at every Vogue handbag pattern and just double check I don't miss this one. Anyway, that's exciting. Okay, so then, and related to that is vintage sewing instruction books. I've sold some just like 1950s, maybe not like the one everybody had simplicity, something, something, something. But some of these are like smaller name, 1940s, how to sew, curtains and, and all sorts of things. And I don't know, some of those can sell really, really well. They're sought after, just sewing instruction books from that time period. But then also, which I've never come across really, they're called sewing pattern counter books. So you go into the sewing store, and on the counter, and you can flip through the counter book, kind of like a catalog, and see which patterns that you want. And people love these things. So a Vogue one is amazing. And, from the 30s, 40s, 50s, if you can find anything like that, then they can sell, $50 to $100, if not more, because it's all the styles all together, and collectors love that. I know there was one more thing I needed to say about the Vogue patterns, and I should have had an example. Okay, so we have this like the Paris Original, and then you'll see on the back it shows what kind of label. So if at the sewing store, the person buying the pattern and the clerk remembered to put this label into the envelope, then you could sew that onto your finished product, and it would say Vogue right on it, right? But not everybody included it. So if you have a pattern like this and it shows a label, and you kind of pull your pattern out and shake it around and try to see if the label is in there, you're going to want to also photograph that and mention that in your listing, that you have the label. That's a good thing.
Okay. That is very cool. the fact that you can have the little label in there.
The little label, I love. It's like one of those. I found the label, and a lot of times they're hidden, like they fall into the folds and creases and stuff. So you kind of do have to shake them a little bit.
All right, so I knew this was going to happen. I knew waiting for this to come up that I've been ignoring the end caps for a while, seeing the prices you just showed. And now that I have this better just jumping off knowledge, or I'm looking for this, this, and this, I'm definitely going to give it the once over, or maybe even twice over that I did a long time ago, but I haven't done in years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely, like I said, I've got a backlog that's crazy, but when you know those big number ones, you know, I have no business buying any more bread and butter patterns, but I will definitely, you know, it's worth flipping through all of them just to see if you can find one of those ones that jump out at you.
Any other questions before we let Shannon go tonight for this awesome number 2 Typhoon? And maybe the feedback has left us. Yay. All right, let's see here. That's a good question, Shannon.
The bottom one there?
Yeah.
So if I see a bundle like at a thrift store and the price is good, I still kind of try to, sometimes it's hard to kind of see in there. There's some thrift stores I go to that they sell 2 or 3 together. That's how they sell all of them. Like, so I want to see that there's one that at least I feel good about. But I don't really want to do an instant purchase on that because they can pile up so quickly in your house. And so there could be a bunch of duds. Totally. They could all be cut and they could all be patterns that are only worth like $2 a piece. So, you know, if you're just getting into it and you want to learn and it's a really good price, then that's education. You just buy it and like go through it and see what you learn from it.
All right. Jenny said she used to throw the outdated catalogs away. Wish she would have kept them.
Mm-hmm.
My Star Wars toys.
Oh yeah, totally.
That's a good question. We'll end on that one. Does the number of the pattern help date it at all?
Not so much. Okay, so a lot of patterns have dates on them. You have to look. Maybe I'll put some examples in the our chat in the Secret Beach, but there's some older ones like the older 50s. There's certain time periods where there's no dates, and then there's time periods where, you know, so some of it, the people who are really into collecting, they know based on the price of the pattern. When it was 15 cents for a pattern, it was 1949, right? And so they know things like that. So just they'll see the cover and they'll know. The database that's on there, I didn't even mention it in this. It's a wiki database, and it's for vintage sewing patterns. And you can search that database, and it'll give you the pattern, and it'll most likely give you the date on there as well. And then I had mentioned this in my blog article that you can actually advertise your pattern listing in that database as well. So that's just another side little thing.
All right, so we'll end on my mom's comment. Shannon, thank you for all your fabulous knowledge.
Oh, no problem.
and I thank you too. Again, I cannot wait. I cannot wait to go out and look next week when I'm out thrifting. I'm hunting all those end caps at Savers here. So if any of you Vegas beachcombers are watching, you better do it before like next Monday or Tuesdays when I'm gonna get out there and do some thrifting. All right, Shannon. Yes, work on your profit piles, your hundreds, maybe thousands.
I might count. I don't know.
Thank you again for doing this. If you didn't watch live, that's cool. If you watch after the fact, you got any questions, just pop that question onto the post in the Secret Beach, and Shannon will be happy to answer it. Or if I can answer it, or anybody else can answer it, like Christine or Jenny, who's ever around and can answer it. We're always happy to help each other out. And Andrew said, looks like he's had to go through all his Vogue patterns. So yeah, if anyone who watched this had some patterns, if you've got any gems, let us know when you get when you find, if you find one of them $100 ones tonight, throw it up in the Secret Beach.
Definitely.
That would be awesome. All right, everybody, have a good evening. My webinar will be up in the next few days, so pay attention for the date. And Thrifty Business this Thursday is going to be awesome. The eBay Shine Award winner from this past eBay Open. So it's going to be a good week of fun stuff. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. Aloha.